So with what geologists are calling the Anthropocene, a lot of talk about destruction and repair has taken a universalist tone, as if there is some kind of human we that can get together and recover from the messes of capitalism, colonialism, and militarism. This discourse falls politically flat when it produces a common humanity only in the imagination of those who profit from anthropogenic mass destruction, and most of us fall unwittingly into that category. This kind of framing runs contrary to the long history of work in critical disciplines like feminist studies, calling for specificity and attention to political context. For example, global climate change is everybody's problem, but it's produced by inequality and extraction. I was living in Amman, Jordan, that terrible winter when millions of Syrians were running for their lives into Jordan. At the same time, Jordan faced a surprising snowfall. The snow and the war coincided. Babies froze to death in the streets of Amman. It was a moment of intense confluence between global and local forces, none of them lacking economic and historical traces to the arms trade, global north energy consumption, and geopolitical restructuring. It was not quite appropriate, I felt, for Israel to lend Jordan snowplows in the name of our common enemy, climate change. Such a claim erased the political context in which Syrian children were freezing to death. So to me, reparations, as a concept, offers an opening to engage the historical and political specificity of each call for urgent and extensive repair, particularly in the wake of war. Reparations accounts for people finding a way to generate conditions for resurgence in the best interest of a global we, with a full account for the fact that there are victims, perpetrators, and players in between. But it can't simply be imagined as repair plus politics, or snowplow plus acknowledgement. The history of reparations implementation has always been fraught with misuse. So often, repair is just a dirty suture to ruptures that cannot or should not be closed. For example, many people rightly think about reparations as hush money. Most of the U.S. legal system is structured around this framework. Workers' compensation, for example, caps the dollar amount injuries are worth and requires confidentiality upon the receipt of funds. The framework for repair, in this case, at the intersection of labor, private property law through marriage and slavery, and the personhood of corporations, is a systematized version of payment for silence and an unequal distribution of justice. This is why Ta-Nehisi Coates calls for the reparations of African Americans not for slavery, but for racist housing, employment, and education policies directly linked to GI bills and U.S. military efforts. He's quite clear about the importance of locating and quantifying individual cases rather than proposing a blanket system of symbolic justice. For Coates, specific calculations are central to the functionality of reparations work. Conversely, Susan Slimovich, writing about her relatives' debate on whether or not to accept German reparations for the Holocaust, discusses quantification as erasure. On the one hand, to receive money from Germany is to accept acknowledgement that wrong was done. But on the other hand, to receive a sum of money is to accept that the sum represents an appropriate quantification of the damage, and that further discourse is not necessary. The dilemmas of how to receive reparations index broader dilemmas on how to give reparations. Are there ever conditions when one could demand more or seek reparations that exceed the consent of the oppressor? I'm inspired by the case of the so-called comfort women. Korean comfort women in particular have repeatedly refused to accept money from Japan, instead insisting their demands be met, which include public education in high school textbooks, memorialization in public art, and an international apology. For them, monetization and quantification are not an option. Skeptical of the many examples of reparations, I could go on, and how they're quantified and distributed by states and governments, I join a group of Americans and Europeans who nonetheless seek to practice a grassroots version of reparations work in partnership with Iraqi and Palestinian people. I will outline some conditions that might allow us to achieve both the political and restorative aims of the concept, and try to sidestep some of the dilemmas. So first, it has to be grassroots. I don't think we can dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. The bureaucracy of a state, and in this case we're talking about its quantification and distribution devices, are often the very thing that produce mass violence. How then can it also be the system by which reparations are determined and distributed? So first, I'd like to call for reparations as a grassroots practice and abolish it as a state practice. Reparations can't be a matter of governments making post-war deals that have little or negative bearing on ordinary people, which they most often are. And while I'm respectful of people calling for their governments to pay reparations, I'm wary that the conditions by which such a process is administered can never be determined by the people themselves. So scaling down gets us to the important social and moral specificity that Coates is asking for. For myself, I learned it this way. During the Cold War, U.S. plutonium production became an important offshoot of the Manhattan Project. The waste products from plutonium yielded strontium-89 and 90, along with tens of other radioactive byproducts. In the mid-40s, the question was, what do we do with all this extra stuff? Dr. Joseph Hamilton of UC Davis, which is where I studied as an undergraduate, was commissioned by the U.S. Army to research the tactical properties of strontium. He concluded that the best way to use strontium would be to distribute it through tactical dust and smoke, weather inversion, and groundwater to incapacitate and hopefully kill whole villages. He went on in his journal. It is enough to make everyone nauseated and vomiting and incapacitated within 24 hours. But he also writes that like a ticking time bomb, buried deep inside the body, it can kill whole communities over an extended period of time, making it possible for the enemy to watch an entire generation die off. This history matters as I find myself sitting with Iraqi families impacted by strontium and a slew of other toxins. I can articulate very clearly that as an American citizen, I want to offer reparations, that I believe I am personally responsible for my share of the destruction in Iraq, because in spite of my best effort to avoid paying for military operations, I have not only contributed to, but also inherited and benefited from the economic boons of plunder in Iraq with a flow of resources that bolster my employer, University of California. I have inherited from Hamilton certain obligations to those whole communities he was prepared to kill. Public truth-telling avoids the dirty suture. Silence is exactly the violence reparations seeks to undermine, and because damage cannot be simply quantified or monetized, a condition of reparations includes truth-telling and historical narration as a collaborative practice. Reparations includes the speech act of self-implication and bearing the obligation to push for public recognition. In this way, we take up each other's urgencies without eclipsing them. So second, reparations have to be helpless. One of the most pernicious components of depoliticized repair is the sense of helping or saving. It is part of that universalist call to clean up messes of war in the name of humanitarianism rather than in the name of politically specific responsibilities. In the case of Iraq or Palestine, where U.S. complicity is direct and ongoing, it's clear that people need as little help from Americans as they can get. It is precisely the condition of aid and dependency that produced the violations for which we are most responsible. On the other hand, the reverse is equally problematic. It is not the job of suffering people to help perpetrators recover from the addictions and psychoses of plunder. Reparations need to be mutual and address ongoing dynamics of power and inequality. So third, reparations have to be ambiguous. Of course, there is no clear distinction between victim and perpetrator. For example, I'm Iraqi American. Do I owe reparations or am I owed reparations? By whom? For which of the many violations made and endured in my name? So often academics take the stance of witness, as if they are absolved from their material involvement in war and violation. And so often the claims are made that governments are the devil and the rest of us are just people, who all suffer at the hands of warfare. For example, it is true that my university thrived while universities in Iraq were plundered and dismantled. And it's also true that my own university was impoverished because of the same programs that plundered the Iraqi academy. An American soldier suffers from war differently than an Iraqi or an Afghani. In other words, plunder, suffering, and responsibility are not simple or unidirectional. But we can't have a world where people throw up their hands, unwilling to take personal responsibility simply because they too suffer. We can do better. There is no pure victim, perpetrator, or witness, but a lack of purity or clarity doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of being perpetrators. So what ethical framework do I build to make human interaction possible, even mutual, given the coincidences that link me to Hamilton's strontium-89 and 90 when I arrive in Iraq decades later? So suddenly, I'm in a refugee community in Kirkuk, and I'm shaking hands with an Anbari farmer. A small amount of her spit rests on my cheek, and she kisses me 1, 2, 3 times. Yeah. We stand in a parentheses together under the dome of unfinished concrete blocks, a little pause in the midst of an intimate encounter of ongoing violation. Her spit on my cheek still glistening, I turn to her son, Azraq, who has blue lips and a puffy face. He's 4 years old, and he sits propped on a pillow and clenches his fist as he concentrates to breathe. Dr. Hamilton died before strontium was used as a weapon, but he predicted and planned its killing properties. There's no proof other than the coincidence of its arrival in Iraqi hair and soil samples, as well as Azraq's personal lab work, that strontium was ever deployed. But no question of ignorance can defend us from facing Azraq not as witnesses, but as witness perpetrators, as audience members in this story, or as a scholar in the very university that weaponized strontium, and the same strontium that entered his mother's lungs and uterine walls to induce his life-threatening birth defect. So we don't interact mutually, and we can't. I'm going to take a little extra time. Fourth, reparations are ongoing. I would like to argue that there is no such thing as the post-war, and that to imagine it is a very dangerous foreclosure. As Audra Simpson argues, most violations are ongoing. I call your attention to the BDS movement in Palestine. It's a call from Palestinian civil society to boycott, divest from, and sanction the Israeli occupation of Palestine. It's a call for reparations that accounts for ongoing financial, military, and social complicity in the U.S. Prevention and intervention are parallel and sometimes primary components of reparations work. Reparations may very often mean what Israeli historian Ilan Pappé was calling for, a boycott of oneself, or other acts of political struggle that are considered suicidal. Ongoingness means that it is not enough to repair Azraq's heart defect to send him home again. I am bound by his mother's spit on my cheek to prevent the sale of weapons and aircraft to the Iraqi government dropping bombs on Fallujah. And I am bound to fight for his right of return, to tell his story, to live as a small part of his childhood, knowing the intimate truths of his displacement, loss of education, poor health, constant uncertainty, and dispossession from his family farm. I am swept up, personally, in an ongoingness with Azraq, one that includes my own continued role in the violation of his country and people. So reparations cannot insist on the precondition of aftermath, or post, as an event before we can begin the work of repair. Finally, reparations is work without absolution. Even if we accept quantification of life and livelihoods, which I feel is only possible with the calculators of war under conditions of supremacy, but if we accept such quantification, we can easily arrive at the conclusion that most anthropogenic destruction is irreparable, and that any repair effort would be only a patchy fraction of what is required to balance such moral and practical budgets. There cannot be an illusion of absolution for recipients or payers of reparations. An absolution model of reparations is likely to generate the self-indulgence so common among the figure of the wounded warrior, one who suffers from his own violence and needs attention, forgiveness, and care. Reparations are not about the warrior, and if the figure of the warrior, seeking to repair his damages, makes it about himself, it is simply not reparations, but an abuse of the concept. The possibility of moral absolution is a desire situated squarely within the hierarchies of moral accumulation. To understand reparations, I often fall back on a much demonized concept, an eye for an eye. Let's remove for a second the white picket fence that liberals put around acceptable notions of violence and nonviolence for a second. The eye for the eye sets a condition of absolute equality. What it means is that my eye is worth the same pricelessness as yours. It is a notion that prevents violence by insisting from the beginning on real equality. If I pluck out your eyes, you, my equal, may pluck out mine. Your gaze upon me is no less meaningful than mine upon you. My ability to see depends on your ability to see. This is a framework for reparations that moves outside of institutionalization or monetization. It requires us to move our children, our spit, our bodies, our gaze, and our resources fluidly, intimately, and painfully. So to conclude, reparations has to be grassroots, it has to be helpless, ambiguous, ongoing, and without absolution. Reparations calls us to refuse private property. We are asked to engage in collective repair by opening up that thing we hold as our most private property, our morality. Thank you.